You don't need 50 tubes of watercolor to create beautiful, effective paintings. Hi, I'm Ashy, and in this video, we're going to talk about limited palettes. And we're gonna show how this powerful tool can really level up your watercolor paintings and your color mixing abilities. So let's flow into the discussion. So first off, what is a limited palette? So a limited palette is where you select 2 to 3 colors. You could select up to 4 probably and still be considered a limited palette. And we use those colors to create the entire painting. And that doesn't mean that your work will look boring or flat. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So when you limit the number of colors that you use, you decrease the risk of muddy mixes where your paintings look tortured and overworked. It also helps you be a lot more thoughtful with your mixes and can really help you to understand the properties of your paints and how they interact with each other. So why are some reasons that we might want to limit ourselves to a small limited palette? Well, the first is that it can really encourage consistency across the painting. So if you're choosing only 3 colors, then everywhere that you have a yellow, for example, it's going to be a similar hue of yellow. You can mix it to push it one direction or the other if you want it to be warmer or cooler. If you don't know what that means, check out video number 2 in the watercolor series. That's all about warm and cool colors. But you can shift the paints, but the base hue is going to be the same, which is going to create an easier color harmony in your painting. It also makes mixing more intuitive. If you don't have as many colors to choose from, you're going to be able to just pick up color and start mixing without having to think about it as much. It's a ton easier if you're going plein air painting or doing travel painting or travel sketching to only have a few colors versus a huge palette of 50 or 100 colors. There are literally palettes that are that big or bigger, but it's a whole lot easier to take a small palette with just 8, 10, 12 colors in a small tin versus having a huge palette that you have to lug around. It will also kind of help you learn that sometimes color isn't the most important. A lot of times value, intensity, and saturation are going to be a lot more important in creating an effective painting than just choosing and chasing certain colors. Now, sometimes you want to mix a perfect color for that amazing flower that's like this bright purple, right? Maybe you want to try to mix that, or you might need a convenience color for that. But for the most part, the color itself is not going to be as important to your painting as the way that the color is used. And lastly, it's just cheaper. If you don't have to buy as many colors, it's way less barrier for entry. So I highly recommend starting with a limited palette just for being cost effective. You can get higher quality paints that are going to last longer because you don't have to use as much of them. But buy fewer of them. So the cost for a limited palette of higher quality paints might be the same as the cost of one of the large palettes of lower quality paints. And you're going to likely have a more enjoyable experience using those higher quality paints. Now, there's nothing against some of the lower quality paints, some of the student grade paints, they're excellent. They're fun to paint with, but in general, you're going to get more bang for your buck out of a professional paint than you will out of a student grade. And then in addition to that, not having to buy as many as startup costs, if you learn how to mix your own colors with a limited number of paints, you won't feel the need to go out and buy every new convenience color that comes out. So a convenience color is one that is pre-mixed in the tube. So it's not gonna be your primary colors. So think your purples and your greens. Now, some of those are great to have. I love having multiple greens in my palette, but I still mix most of my greens, even though I have those greens in my palette, because I understand how to shift the colors and shift the color temperatures and create those different hues just with mixing. Now, there are always some paints that are super fun to have and have different properties, and we can dive into that in another video where we look at things like staining and granulation and lifting and all of these things that are unique to watercolor paints that you might want to buy some of those convenience colors, but it might not necessarily be for the color. It might be for those other qualities, especially if you already know how to mix different colors. So let's go ahead and take a look at some different options for limited palettes that you might choose and why you might choose those. So first off, we can choose the CMY triad, right? So this would be a limited palette that follows the CMY color wheel, which is the modern color wheel. My first video talks all about the difference between the traditional red, blue, yellow color wheel and the more modern CYM color wheel. So you can look at that, but the colors that you would probably want to choose for that would be in the range of a quinacridone rose or a magenta. You would want to choose a primary yellow, so one that doesn't lean too green and doesn't lean too orange. So if we look at this Hansa yellow light, it is very yellow. If we look at New Gamboge, it's also yellow, but it's a much more orangey yellow. When you hold them next to each other, it looks orange. But in the paintings, it's definitely yellow, but it's a very warm yellow. Okay, so you would want to choose a primary yellow, not an orangey yellow. You would want to choose a magenta or like a deep rose. And then you would want to choose a cyan. So my version of cyan is phthalo blue green shade. And these are Daniel Smith paints, but you can find them in any paint. You're going to see the options for the CYM color wheel in any paint that you can get, basically. The blue is probably the hardest to determine which one is going to be more cyan. So it's a slightly greener blue. It's not a purpley blue. So you wouldn't want to choose like an ultramarine that's a lot more purpley. You want to choose one that's slightly on the greener side, okay? And that triad will create this color wheel, okay? So this triad creates this color wheel. So you can see how that gives us a huge range of colors. And this is really good for mixing really, really bright, vibrant hues. Okay, so you're going to be able to get super bright, vibrant greens, super bright, vibrant purples, and then oranges as well. So you're going to get a whole range of color mixing. And then if you add contrasting colors, you're going to get neutrals. So you can see how, you know, combining your blues and your oranges can make browns, and combining blue and like a greenish blue and a pinky red can create like a neutral purple, gray color. So you're going to be able to get a huge range, nearly every hue. Not every hue, but nearly every hue by doing these three colors. So an example of a painting that uses this type of triad, now I can't say for sure that this artist used this exact triad, but an example of a painting for that would be this painting here, which is Helen Frankenthaler's. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but it's Mountains and Sea. And you can see how she uses a limited number of colors to create this effective kind of abstract painting. And it's using those bright, vibrant colors that can be mixed from the hues that are in the cyan, magenta, and yellow color. So another option for kind of a triad of a limited palette would be kind of a natural earthy tone palette. And for that, you wouldn't necessarily want to pick your bright, vibrant C and Y colors. You would want to go with probably a little bit more traditional red, blue, yellow, but on the earthier side. So an option for that, a great option for blue is French Ultramarine blue. It's a very traditional pigment, and it mixes to create much more earthy tones. So if you look at our RBY color wheel, you can see that the greens in this, same yellow, but different blue. The greens are much more natural looking versus these vibrant, like springy, almost artificial greens. And then our purples, this is mixed with a very orangey red. So our purples are going to be a lot more neutral as well. If you mixed it with a pink, you're going to get a more vibrant purple, but it's not going to be as vibrant as this. So this is ultramarine mixed with pink. And you can see it's a more natural, neutral purple than this one. Okay, so ultramarine's a great option. For your yellow, you can use something like New Gamboge, which is a very orangey yellow. I have a swatch of it right here. This one is New Gamboge, which is this color. So in mass tone, it looks almost orange, but when you shear it out, it's a lot more yellow. And then that's going to mix to create very, very earthy greens. So these are a lot more brownish because this has a yellow undertone. And then the ultramarine has a slightly purple undertone. Yellow and purple are opposites, and they're gonna mix to create a much more neutral green. But it's still green because they're not actually yellow and purple or orange and blue. They're still yellow and blue. But because of the direction that they lean, it's creating a lot more neutral. So New Gamboge is an option for that. And then yellow ochre is another option. So I have yellow ochre in my palette here. I'm going to, I closed this while this was still wet. So I have a chunk of red there that won't come off because that's a staining color. Anyway, that's a different conversation. But let's take yellow ochre. Okay, so this one's yellow ochre. And you can see, same idea as the New Gamboge. It's a much warmer yellow, much more natural, like sandy yellow. So if I mix that with ultramarine, I have ultramarine in my palette as well. Just gotta make sure I'm actually picking ultramarine. There's ultramarine, okay? So then if I mix those two, so that's a more yellowy green. I can add more blue to it and create a more bluey green. But you can see it's almost gray, okay? Because I'm mixing that very orangey neutral yellow with the blue, okay? So if you want to get bright greens, this is not the color palette to go with, okay? This is not going to create really bright greens. It's going to create very, very muted colors, okay? So the New Gamboge does create, I would say, a little bit more green than the yellow ochre. The yellow ochre is much more neutral and brownish in general and orangey brown than New Gamboge. Okay, I don't think I have any New Gamboge out. Let me squeeze a little bit of that out. Okay, so that's wet paint, so I need very little. Okay, so if I mix that with, oh, my ultramarine has some pink in it. It's very, there we go. If I go on the edge, it's kind of pink. So if I mix those, that's a lot more green than that. They're both green, but this is more green. And this is more brown. Okay, so, but both are very earthy. So that's an option for your yellows. And then for your reds, you could choose something like a Burnt Sienna that is a very orangey color. So this one is burnt. Well, again, dirty palette. Okay, that's Burnt Sienna. So it's brown. I mean, flat out, it's brown. It's not going to be a red, but it is a reddish brown, okay? But we're not gonna get purples when we mix these. We're going to get brown when we mix the ultramarine and the Burnt Sienna, okay? So we're not going to get vibrant purples. That is a beautiful color in landscapes though, okay? Mixing those colors is just gorgeous and it makes beautiful grays, okay? And you can make it shift a little bit purpley. Like, that's kind of purpley if we put more blue. So that's a good option for creating kind of a earthy triad. And you can get, again, you can get some nice earthy greens that shift more blue or shift more yellow. And then you can get very pretty neutrals, but you're not going to get a vibrant purple out of this triad. Okay. So I would probably not choose the yellow ochre just because you can't get as good of greens. I would go with something like a new Gamboge, a Burnt Sienna, and a French Ultramarine. You could do a Hansa yellow light or a lemon yellow deep if you wanted a more yellowy yellow, and you would just get slightly more vibrant greens, but you can choose whatever you want with the yellow, but the ultramarine is a great color. If you wanted to add a pink or a red in there, I would go with kind of a neutral one. So Pyrrole Scarlet is pretty orange, so I probably wouldn't go with that. I would go with a quinacridone rose or magenta to round out that palette. And then you're going to be able to get some purples if you wanted purples. And that's still a very limited palette, right? So this, though, would be our kind of earthy triad. John Constable used something similar to an earthy triad in his painting, The Wain. And so you can see how we have very beautiful luminous neutrals, especially like up in the clouds. You can see that it's kind of purpley, but it's not really purple. And then you have your beautiful greens that are very natural and earthy, and your deep kind of burnt orangey colors for the land. And so that's a way to use the kind of neutral landscape triad. Another option for this triad would be for portraits that look very natural and almost historical. So if you look at Vermeer's The Girl with the Pearl Earring, he used a very similar triad with the yellow ochres, the ultramarine blue, and then some like burnt oranges. And so you can use them very effectively to create portraits. And for portrait painting, limited palettes are very helpful because portraits in watercolor are very easy to overwork and make it look tortured and forced versus natural and light and luminous, how you really want watercolors to look, usually. I mean, I guess everybody's different. But for the most part, using a limited palette in portrait painting is very helpful so that you're not creating these like tortured mixes. For a much more vibrant triad option, you could choose something like a cobalt blue, a permanent rose, and then you could stick with, bright primary yellow or a new Gamboge. Either way, you're going to create really bright, vibrant mixes with this, and it makes a really good choice for like sunny, vibrant outdoor scenes or like soft lighting indoor scenes that aren't like dark and moody. So if we combine cobalt blue, and again, I have the Winsor & Newton colors in this palette, so I'm not squeezing out more, but these are the Winsor & Newton colors that I have out here. So if I take my cobalt blue, okay, and mix that with permanent rose, we're gonna create fairly vibrant purples, but they're still soft. They're not like neon, okay? And then I can take my Hansa yellow light, okay, and mix that with the blue and create a beautiful, not too vibrant green, okay? So it's still a natural green. It's not like neon green, but it's gonna be more vibrant than mixing a ultramarine with the Hansa yellow. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of the range of greens that we can get. And then mixing the permanent rose with the yellow gets us some vibrant oranges, okay? And then we can mute it out and mix all of those colors to create some interesting browns, okay? So that's a bright kind of warm landscape or interior scene or portrait triad. So you can still create nice, soft, subtle portraits. It's not going to be as kind of antique feeling as your more neutral triad though. So an example of this is Mary Cassatt's The Child's Bath. So again, this is that interior scene, but it has that like light little bit of vibrancy that you don't see with some of the other historical, more natural triads. So these have a little bit more of those brighter pigments with the cool blues and then the pinks and then the soft yellows versus the more earthy tones. So then a great option if you want to have variety but still stick with a limited palette is called a split primary palette. So in our second video, we talked all about warm and cool colors. So if you didn't catch that one, you should go back and watch that video. But each color has a warm and a cool version. So if you look at your original color wheel of red, yellow, blue, or even cyan, yellow, and magenta, you can use that to build a split primary palette. So you would want a warm and a cool version of each of those colors. So one of the best options for that that's already comes in a set is the Daniel Smith split primary set. And I have this set right here. It's these 6 colors, okay? And this is the whole set. And you have a cool yellow that's not orangey. It's a little bit on the greener side, but it's still yellow. And a warm yellow, so this is a little bit orangey. Then you have a cool red, which is going to be a pink. I highly recommend selecting a pink for your cool red, and then a more warm orangey red. And then you have a cool blue, which is a greenish blue, and a warm blue, which is a purplish blue. And with this, you can mix and create any of the palettes that we discussed in this in these triads, right? So here's some different combinations, okay? So we have this warm red, the warm blue, and the primary yellow. And you can create some very earthy tones. You get a little bit of vibrancy in the yellows, but not a ton. If you do the more orangey yellow with the ultramarine, warm blue, you're gonna get more earthy. Here you can get super vibrant greens and very neutral purples. So you can mix these to create all of these different hues of colors and get the biggest range. And then when you're painting, you can select like, well, I'm gonna do 3 colors and I'm gonna choose, you know, my CYM palette, or I'm gonna choose my bright primary palette, or I'm gonna choose my earthy palette with just a little bit more on the purples. So I'm gonna do the rose instead of the warm red. Okay, so you can then select and choose which ones you want to use for each painting. Now, if you wanted to add to a split primary palette, right? Because I'm not saying that you should only ever paint with 6 colors. There's no way that I would say that. So if you wanted to add some colors to this, you might want to pick some neutrals. So that's where like your burnt sienna comes in. It's brown, right? So you could throw a burnt sienna in and have that as an option. You might want a really dark color that's a convenience color that you don't have to mix. And in that case, you might want to choose an indigo or a Payne's gray. Depending on the brand, Payne's gray can be more blue or it can be more pure gray. The Winsor & Newton Professional Payne's gray is pretty blue. So it's a nice choice if you want a interesting neutral that leans cool, because then you have the burnt sienna, which is a warm neutral, and a cool Payne's gray, bluish neutral. Indigo would be another option for that. It's a little bit more blue, but they're both kind of a neutral-ish blue. Okay, so you might want to throw one of those in. And then maybe you don't want to have to mix your greens every single time. So you could throw in maybe an olive green, which is a warm green. It's kind of in this range, okay? Or you could throw in a sap green, which is going to be a much cooler green that's more vibrant. So it's going to be more in the vibrant range, maybe over here, somewhere around there. But you could throw in one or two of those colors. There are also other convenience colors. You know, some people like to have purples in their palette. I have a couple purples. I'm not a huge purple person. You might want to throw like a deep dark red in there. So the two reds that I have in my palette that are not my pink, which is permanent rose, I have alizarin crimson, which is a darker red, but it's cool. So I can show you my swatching sheet here. So this one is permanent rose. Okay. This is alizarin crimson. So it's a little bit more on the red side, but you can very easily shift permanent rose toward alizarin crimson by adding some yellow. So you don't need it. You might want this one, which is like a brownish red. That's perline maroon, right? So that's maybe a little bit more steps, a little bit harder to mix. You have to add an extra couple colors to it to mix it. So that's, you know, convenience colors are just that. It takes the mixing out of it so that you don't have to have as many steps. So to create this olive green, you would need to add blue and yellow to make green. And then you would probably want to add a little bit of red in there to tone it down and use that contrasting color. So that's more steps to create that green. So maybe you just want that green in your palette. And that's fine if that's what you choose. But starting with a limited palette like this, and then very purposefully selecting extra colors to go with it is what I suggest. Once you find out I'm mixing these colors over and over, I just want to have an olive green in my palette. Go pick up an olive green, right? I'm mixing this burnt orange color over and over, and I always need that brown. You can purchase a burnt sienna, okay? So that's what I recommend for convenience colors. I don't like spending a lot of money, so I don't want to buy all of the colors all at once. I add them slowly based on what I find that I need, or in the example of all of my little tubes of Winsor & Newton, when they went on ridiculous clearance at Hobby Lobby because they stopped selling them at Hobby Lobby. So that's where I got almost all of my colors because they were like, honestly, like $1 or $2 a tube. It was ridiculous because they were just getting rid of them. So I bought a ton. And so that's how I have a lot of convenience colors. But you can see in my palette, I don't use them like much at all. So I use yellow ochre a lot. I use burnt sienna a lot. And I use olive green a lot. I've had to refill that one a lot of times. But like, this is Cobalt Green Deep. It's a beautiful color. I rarely use it. Same with aqua green. I don't use it that much. I don't use indigo that much. It's beautiful, but I don't use it. I don't really use my purples that much. Like, I've never refilled these. And I've had them for a long time. Maybe a year, maybe more. So, you know, I have all these colors, but that doesn't mean that I'm using all of them. It just means that they were really cheap, so I bought them. But if I were to, you know, have to buy them full price, I would not have bought all of these colors. I would have stuck with my limited palette because I can mix all of these hues. Pretty much all of them, with the exception of Opera Rose. Opera Rose is a neon pink that I don't know how you would go about mixing that. So if you like neon colors, you might have to buy those. So one great example of a painter who really mastered the limited palette is Singer Sargent. So he used a surprisingly simple palette, and he used basically a split primary palette with 2 blues, 2 yellows, and 2 reds. And he used that to create his vast range of landscape scenes, capturing different lightings, different weather phenomenon, and all of the different times of day, all of the moods, with a very simple split primary set. So you can see in this painting, Simplon past the Tease, this was created using a split primary set, essentially. So you can create beautiful paintings with a limited number of colors. So just remember that mastering color isn't about collecting tubes. If you like to collect tubes of paint, you are welcome to. Art supply collecting is a whole nother habit and whole nother hobby versus actually painting. So if that's what you like, do it. But if you don't want to, or you don't have the money to, and you don't want to invest that way, creating art with a limited palette is super effective and successful. And it really can actually help improve your mixes. It can train your eye to see things, and it can really help you learn more about your paints and their properties and their qualities, so that you can then intuitively mix and paint with a more efficient and intuitive technique. And you might find when you pick just 3 paintings, you might actually feel like you're more free to create rather than feeling limited and constrained. It's very interesting how limiting the number of supplies can actually make you feel more bold and free in your creative habit. So in our next video in the series, we're going to talk about how we can use reference photos, but then shift the colors to really play on certain moods or emotions, or evoke certain things that we want the viewer to see. So it's not about copying the reference, it's about creating a piece of art based on a reference. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit the like button. It would help out my channel a lot. Also, subscribe to the channel. You don't want to miss anything. Hit the notification bell and you'll get notified every time a new video comes out. And we have more to this series, so you definitely want to do that. And leave a comment in the comments below and we can start a conversation. I'd love to know what your go-to 3 favorite pigments are. What are your 3 favorite paints for creating a limited palette? Or what do you have to have in your palettes? I'd love to hear. Thank you again so much, and until next time, keep those paints flowing.